Hello everyone and welcome back to Intellectual Potluck for part 2 of our history series. And since this episode is meant to go out on or around the 25th of February, I want to talk about one of the most pivotal moments in Soviet history that happened on that date, which was Khrushchev's secret speech. I'm a little bit of a Cold War junkie, so I'm really excited to look into this topic and to talk about it with you guys. So this is going to be a very broad overview once again, giving that higher level view and not delving too much into the nitty gritty because otherwise we will be here for hours and I'm sure that no one wants to hear me prattling on for that long. So we're going to do the broad overview and then maybe in a future episode we'll dive a bit more into specific things that happened and go a bit more into the nitty gritty. The purpose of the speech was for Khrushchev to outline his agenda and break down some of the personality cult that Stalin had created in his time as leader. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a bit of the background and how the cult of Stalin developed, Khrushchev's speech itself, and what that then led to. So to give a quick overview of the background, and I say quick, I'm sure it won't be, but we're gonna try. The full story of how Stalin came into power could be an episode in itself, but I want to give you guys some context so that you can understand the power that the cult of personality that he created had. So we're going to start back in 1917 and the Russian Revolution, or October Revolution as it is sometimes known. Tsar Nicholas was overthrown by the Bolsheviks and they formed a government under Vladimir Lenin and created the new Communist Party. Again, that is the bare bones of what happened. There is so much to talk about in that in itself, but you just need to know that Tsar Nicholas lost his power and the Bolsheviks took over, with Lenin in charge. As so often happens when you overthrow a leader, not everyone was very happy with it. So this did lead to a civil war. The Red Army, which was the Bolshevik Communist Army led by Lenin, defeated the White Army, which was the Tsarist loyalists, or anyone else who opposed the Red Army for any number of reasons. But the Red Army won, and following the Civil War, there was some level of unrest, and the Bolsheviks did conduct things like mass executions against supporters of the Tsarist regime to try and ensure that there was no one who would continue to oppose them. So all of that is to say, the 1910s, early 1920s was a very, very turbulent time in Russia. There was a lot that people had to get used to. This kind of government and regime was not anything that anyone was particularly familiar with, and there was a lot of work to be done to build up people's trust. People were very unsure of what was going on and lacked a lot of confidence in the government because it was so different to what they knew. It was a very, very difficult time for people. In 1922, a treaty was created between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and, I'm going to say this wrong, I'm sure, but Transcaucasia, which is modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. These countries formed the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, as it is now very commonly known. And obviously, a union of this size was very powerful. It did have some power behind it and very influential. But it was created to be, I'm going to say, like an equal opportunity alliance. Obviously, different countries had different levels of power, but the idea wasn't that one country ruled all. They were supposed to be a union and working together. And this was somewhat of a compromise from what Stalin had proposed. He wanted to bring everyone under the Russian Federation, but there had been a lot of resistance. So creating the Union of Nations was Lenin's idea and Lenin's compromise. So in terms of the government structure, in the early 1920s, you had Lenin in charge, and then Stalin was one of the more powerful party players. He was the general secretary, but he had a lot of power, but he wasn't in charge. But he did work very closely with Lenin. Lenin and Stalin had a very up and down relationship, particularly towards the later part of Lenin's life. Lenin's health started to take a turn for the worse in 1923 and 1924. And Stalin was very quick to use this to his advantage. So he began consolidating his power within the party. So he began appointing people who were loyal to him and his supporters into very powerful positions. And in the meantime, he was limiting people's access to Lenin. Under the guise of Lenin's in poor health, let him rest, I'll deal with it all. There were some people who had access to him, but it was so limited, so restricted. For the most part, people had to trust a lot of what Stalin said. So this idea of him being Lenin's right-hand man and them working so closely together was really reinforced by that. Even though behind the scenes, Lenin was far less confident in their relationship than Stalin would have you believe. So towards the end of his life, Lenin began to compile a political testament, which quite openly expressed his distrust of Stalin and also some of the other leaders within the Communist Party. He expressed doubts over a lot of people and a lot of criticisms, and he did warn people of the possibility of a split within the party because there was such rivalry between Stalin and one of the other prominent players, which was Trotsky. So he warned people that they needed to take measures to try and prevent this divide or to prevent things from getting out of hand. And one of the things that he very strongly urged in his testament was for Stalin to be removed as general secretary. A lot of the other things that he said were fairly loose and open to interpretation and just complaints on people's personalities, but that one thing was very specific. However, Lenin died before he was able to put his testament forward to the other leaders. He had some very serious health complications in 1924, and he passed away in January of 1924 before he was able to share this testament with people. He had shared it with his loved ones, and they did then share it with the party, and no one questioned the legitimacy of it really. People believed that this, came from him, but because it criticized so many people within the party, there was a lot of people who wanted to keep it really hush-hush, Stalin in particular. Following Lenin's death, Stalin had moved very quickly to put himself into the position of power and to establish himself as Lenin's successor. And he did make sure that any references to this testament were deemed to be anti-Soviet and were a punishable offense. And so while we now know from a historical standpoint that Lenin didn't back Stalin and didn't want him as his successor, at the time that information was being suppressed, and even people who knew about it probably didn't feel confident speaking up about it. So all of that is to say, Stalin came into power, and I know I've gone into a bit too much detail there into Stalin's origin story, but I promise it is all relevant and it does all tie together, because how Stalin created the cult of Stalin was by leveraging a lot of what is known as the cult of Lenin. I think it's important to note here as well that an important part of socialism and communism in particular is presenting a united front. So once it was established that Stalin was going to be the successor, people kind of had to, outwardly at least, agree with it. So whilst behind closed doors, leaders may be more outspoken and may have had other opinions about Stalin becoming the leader, outwardly into the general public, they had to present a united front for the most part. The way that their party was structured emphasized loyalty and conformity. So it was really hard for people to have a differing opinion without it being seen as dissent. And this can also lead to a lot of peer pressure within the party. If you've ever read the book Animal Farm, yes, it's fictional, but it gives a really good representation of the kind of thing that was going on in this period. So the character Old Major is supposed to represent both Karl Marx and Lenin. Snowball represents Trotsky, and Napoleon represents Stalin. And it is, of course, hugely simplified. But if you want a bit of a view of what was going on politically and how that whole journey happened, I would definitely recommend giving it a read. It's I wouldn't call it a fun book, but it's a kind of fun way of getting your head around it, because it was complex. But the main points to remember are that Stalin put himself in a position where the party had a lot of people who were loyal to him. He'd managed to establish himself as Lenin's right-hand man and therefore natural successor. And because of this idea of conformity within the party and the suppression of Lenin's testament that expressly said that he didn't want this, it led to Stalin being in power. But then we move on to the personality cult that Stalin created around himself. It's believed that it was Stalin's belief, and he could well have been right on this, but that in order to solidify his leadership, he had to gain the support, especially when you consider that a lot of the things that he wanted to do and ultimately did were very extreme. If you know about Stalin's time in power, you know that he did a lot of awful and very extreme things, and that would have come with resistance both from the party, the general public, and also internationally. So he had to, in a way, create this cult of personality around himself so that people would defend his actions. And whilst he had already used his position as general secretary to build up a lot of support and people who were loyal to him within the party, he still needed to build a justification for the shift away from some of the things that Lenin had done. In particular, he wanted to move from Lenin's more collective leadership model towards a more centralized and autocratic system. But making that shift isn't as simple as it sounds because, as I mentioned before, Lenin had his own personality cult. He was the original leader. So Stalin wasn't going to be able to make these shifts without anyone noticing. So what Stalin tried to do instead was he built on the hero worship that was already out there for Lenin and worked to transfer that admiration and that trust from Lenin to himself. What Lenin had done was to use his own image and his own personality to become the physical embodiment of Marxism and Leninism. Stalin's plan, because he knew that if he just tried to cut down Lenin's ideas, it would not go over well. So his plan was to turn the admiration and trust that people had in Lenin and just transfer it over to himself. So the first thing that Stalin had to do was to establish himself as Lenin's choice of successor. And we know that Lenin had his doubts about Stalin and that he even wanted to remove him as general secretary. So it'd be a really far stretch to try and say that Stalin was Lenin's choice of successor. But because Stalin had done what he did, where he had very few people have access to Lenin in the final few years of his life, and he'd outlawed any discussion of Lenin's testament, there was very few people who could dispute this claim, because outwardly, Stalin was the person who'd had the most contact with Lenin. And Stalin even took things one step further and even rewrote parts of history to, I guess, fabricate more friendship between himself and Lenin. There's a famous photo that I'll try and put in the video if I can find it again, but he doctored a photo of himself and Lenin together. And I know in this day and age that sounds like a really small thing to do. People fake photos all the time, but back then, like, they didn't have the same overexposure to photos that we do. A photo was a much bigger deal, and it gave the impression of Stalin and Lenin being very tightly aligned and friends and working together. And after Lenin's death, 500,000 copies of this photo began appearing across the Soviet Union. So this was clearly the narrative that Stalin wanted out there. And he even then went back and rewrote other parts of history where key Bolshevik events were now discussed or written about in the context of giving Stalin a much more prominent role in the successful events. He was shown as the key figure or key decision maker in these more successful endeavors. And of course, any that failed, he wouldn't have had his name to. And contributions from other people were very much minimized. But it was kind of sneaky how Stalin went about doing all of this, because outwardly, he was portraying himself as being very modest, rejecting any suggestion that him and Lenin could be on the same level. But then he would do things like for his 50th birthday, he also chose to celebrate Lenin and again tie their two names together. So that was step one. Make everyone think that they were besties and have everyone think that Lenin wanted Stalin to take over from him. A very common tactic that Lenin used was to use his image and, plaster his face everywhere. So all through propaganda, statues, all kinds, anything that you can think, his face was everywhere. So he was very careful to not tear down Lenin's image because, like we said, we know how well that would have gone. But he commissioned a lot of things, or had other people commission for him a lot of things that carried his image. And by the time we reached 1933, central Moscow had twice as many busts and images of Stalin as they did of Lenin. So he wasn't tearing down Lenin, but he was making sure that he was the more prominent face. And Stalin had a very firm belief that because the Russian people had spent so long under Tsarist rule, that people were used to being ruled by a single person, and that this is what people would be more comfortable with. He believed that the peasants wouldn't understand the complexities of the structure of the Soviet Union, and so this was the justification for putting himself as the face of the party. It was to make people feel more comfortable, supposedly. He said that one person would have to be perceived as the ruler, and to use his own words, he said that they would revere and in whose name to live and labor. So basically, people would love him so much that they would live and work for him. So with all of these things, we start to see a gradual shift from, originally people would attribute a lot of the successes of the Soviet Union to both Lenin and Stalin. And then as time goes on, we start to see a shift where they're omitting Lenin's name and just moving towards just saying Stalin. It towed a very delicate line of praising and outwardly respecting Lenin's work, whilst also making it very clear that Stalin was the new way forward. And of course, the Soviet press were constantly praising Stalin, using words like beloved, great, wise, genius. And remember, this is back in a time where people aren't just being inundated with media non-stop. The press had a lot more power than it would nowadays because people aren't just getting their information from all over the place. People relied on the press for a lot of their information. And so people really would absorb the biases that were embedded in the press. Stalin was now being presented as the father of the Soviet Union, and very often he was referring to its peoples as his children. And from 1936, the Soviet press began referring to Stalin as the father of nations. And as we so often see with these propaganda trains, Stalin did put a lot of focus into the propaganda efforts towards children. So he did conduct some very highly publicized gift-giving exchanges with a range of children from a range of different ethnic backgrounds, of course, to promote this image that he is the father and he is supporting his children. But there was also the establishment of organizations like the Komsomol. I'll put it on the screen because I apologize for how I said that. But basically, these were youth groups who were very heavy political lean. And these groups were seen as a way to set your kids up for life. So people did want to enroll their kids in these groups. But in these groups, they were very exposed to the propaganda of the Communist Party. And I mean, these weren't the only influences on kids at the time either. Cartoons like The Stranger Voice were also established. It reinforced the idea of Soviet culture and started to portray anything outside of Soviet culture as strange and unwanted. And then, of course, we have the classic of the school curriculums were adapted to be the Stalinized version of history. So with all this in mind, and remember I mentioned that these nations had gone through a lot during the early 1900s. There's revolutions, civil war, general unrest. People were looking for a stable and secure leader that they could put their trust in and that would get them through this time. So when they were presented with Lenin and then Stalin as this leader, it was natural for them to try and jump on it, especially when Stalin was able to build on what Lenin had already created. For a lot of people, Stalin was taking on a godlike persona. And with this majesty that was being created around him, his name was being tied to all kinds of different things. So, a city was renamed Stalingrad. There was awards named after Stalin. And during World War II, Stalin's name was included in the national anthem. And across many Eastern Bloc countries, Stalin's birthday was also celebrated and treated as a holiday. There were even cities outside of Russia, such as the Bulgarian city of Varna, that were named after Stalin during this period. There were quite a few examples of this, but I really didn't want to butcher all of the pronunciations, so I'll put some up on the screen, and hopefully I don't butcher the spellings. So that gives some idea of what was being done with the general public in terms of building up this cult of personality. Politically, it wasn't quite taken on in the same way, because politically they had a lot more access to information and knew a bit more of what things were being embellished and had differing opinions and differing ideologies. So whilst the Communist Party, as I said, had to outwardly show unity, there were people and there were top-ranking people within the Politburo who did disagree with Stalin, and not every proposal that Stalin put forward was passed. But this was not allowed to be known outside of the party's leadership. And the censorship and peer pressure going on around the political party would have also made it difficult for some oppositionists to express their honest viewpoints. But from a political standpoint, it also wasn't all about the propaganda. There was a huge culture of fear going through the USSR at this time. People were afraid that if they spoke out against him or disagreed with him, it could cost them their lives. From 1936 to 1939, there was what is known as the Great Purge. Stalin used the purge to arrest, imprison, and execute thousands upon thousands of enemies. And this included high-ranking officials and intellectuals and pretty much anyone who could challenge his authority. They also used publicly staged trials for a lot of people, just to further instill that fear and demonstrate the severe consequences of disagreeing with the regime, and reinforcing this idea that agreeing with Stalin was the way to survive. And more broadly, the secret police, known as the NKVD, maintained an atmosphere of constant monitoring. So again, I'm bringing it back to George Orwell books, but think 1984. Think you never know who's watching you. And so even minor deviations from the main party lines could lead to accusations of disloyalty, treason, and come with brutal punishments. Both politicians and civilians feared showing any deviation from the supposed correct way to do things. The regime also imposed some rigorous work targets, which created a climate where citizens feared severe repercussions if they didn't meet those targets, such as unemployment, public shaming, or even arrest if they didn't hit what they were told they should. And the propaganda that was being thrown at people connected hard work to loyalty. So it was, you will work hard because you love Stalin. So therefore, underperforming was disloyal to Stalin. But then on top of these targets, policies like forced collectivization contributed to severe economic hardship and famines. People were struggling to get by, struggling to survive, but still felt like they had to work themselves to the bone because otherwise they were being disloyal. And there was also the fear that you as an individual wouldn't be the only one targeted. Your loved ones could also be targeted, and so your shortcomings could lead to your family suffering. And whilst you might think that this climate of fear would lead to people hating Stalin, it's not necessarily true. We can't speak for everyone, and I'm sure our experiences varied massively throughout this period, but quite often when people are desperate and fearful, they can become more susceptible to propaganda, and they become less likely to question Stalin as a leader. So we had this combined culture of, on the one hand, godlike worship of Stalin, his image being used everywhere, and hard work and loyalty to Stalin being the things that you should be doing in your life. And then you also had this climate of fear, and the two combined is what created this personality cult. So now that we've understood that, let's move on to Khrushchev's speech. So we now know how deeply ingrained this worship of Stalin is. And to speak out against him, even after his death, is a big thing. We saw that even Stalin during his time was very careful to not denounce Lenin or slander Lenin, knowing that that would be a political disaster for him. So this is why Khrushchev's speech was such a big deal and why it shaped so much of the future of the USSR. So for a little bit more, very, very brief, I promise, context, Stalin was in power until his death in March of 1953. There was a very, very, very brief time where Malenkov took over. I think it was barely even 6 months by my maths. So then Khrushchev took over in September of 1953. So we're not going to talk about Malenkov because it was brief and because he's not the main character of this story. So it didn't take long for it to become clear that when Khrushchev came into power, he was keen to distance himself from a lot of what Stalin had done in his time. And I know that I did briefly touch on this, but I cannot stress enough how awful and inhumane and shitty a lot of the things that Stalin did was. And I'm not going to go into too many details because I think exploring that topic deserves more airtime and more focus. I would want to do it justice. So we're just going to hold that in our minds that we know that Stalin did a lot of awful, inhumane stuff. And whilst Khrushchev had his own faults and didn't oppose a lot of what Stalin did when Stalin was in power, he did work to undo a lot of what had been done. So he did make some very big moves to shift the USSR into a position where it was more liberal. And he didn't just jump in on day one of his time in power and suddenly start slamming everything that Stalin had done. That would have been stupid. And even when he made this speech, as I said at the start, it was a secret speech. A very badly kept secret, but a secret nonetheless. It wasn't public knowledge. It was originally just for the leaders. And I am not about to read the whole speech. I've read bits. Apparently it was 4 hours long according to some sources. And, you guys have listened to me enough already. But I have taken some excerpts and they're translated into English because I don't know Russian. But these are some of the excerpts that I found that are interesting to me. So he said, "It is impermissible and foreign to the spirit of Marxism-Leninism to elevate one person, to transform him into a superman possessing supernatural characteristics akin to those of a god." And he also said, "It is here that Stalin showed in a whole series of cases his intolerance, his brutality, and his abuse of power. He often chose the path of repression and physical annihilation, not only against actual enemies, but also against individuals who had not committed any crimes against the party or the Soviet government. If I can find a link to the full speech, I will link that in the episode description if anyone's keen for a really big read. But we can hear even from those two quotes, Khrushchev is trying to mark himself as different from Stalin and not just carrying on with the same regime. And he is calling out some of the things that Stalin had done without necessarily going too hard on it. Throughout the speech, Khrushchev was relatively cautious to keep his indictment of Stalin to the abuses against the Communist Party itself, and kind of glossed against some of Stalin's campaigns of mass terror against the general population. And a lot of that is because, like I said before, he didn't disagree with some of these policies, and many of the other leaders who were still in power also didn't argue against these policies. So calling them out would have just turned people against him, and it could have implicated a lot of people in a lot of different crimes. So he was careful on which things he chose to attack. So once the speech was done, Stalin was not publicly denounced or anything like that. His portrait remained widespread throughout the USSR. I mean, we've said there was so many of them out there. Good luck reining them all in. But, you know, his portrait was even kept in the Kremlin office. They weren't trying to publicly denounce him. Khrushchev was trying to just mark a period of the end of Stalinism and moving towards his new vision for the party and for the country. And so a bit of information on how the secret speech stayed not so secret. It was originally just read to the Congress, but it was soon read to different groups of like party activists or closed local party meetings. And it was never actually made public until 1989. But needless to say, the information and contents of the speech did make its way out into the public. It wasn't a very well kept secret. The overall themes of it became relatively known throughout the USSR, and bits were even known beyond the Eastern Bloc as well and made their way to the Western Bloc. And as I mentioned before, the Communist Party had always had an idea of loyalty and unity. So this idea that Khrushchev was speaking out against his predecessor was a huge shift from what they had done previously. So yes, Stalin's reputation took a hit, but the whole political system and the party overall did also take a hit, because the party are the ones that allowed him to gain and misuse the power that Khrushchev was talking about. The speech is kind of seen by historians as like the line in the sand. This is where the start of de-Stalinisation happened, and it marked a period of liberalization known as the Khrushchev thaw. So a lot of the censorship policies that were in place were relaxed, and thousands of political prisoners were released. Khrushchev hoped that by making this speech it would give some reassurance to some of the politicians who feared the purges that had been happening in the Stalin period would gain some confidence and understand that that wasn't going to be part of the regime moving forward. But he also hoped that some of the liberalization methods and denouncing Stalin would help to ease some of the tensions that were happening internationally and present the USSR as this more progressive nation. There have been a lot of growing discontent among people like across the whole Eastern Bloc, and Khrushchev did hope that this would help to alleviate some of that tension. So for example, East Germany had the 1953 uprising. Khrushchev hoped that even though a lot of people were only hearing it indirectly, it would help to start this idea that, you know, the winds of change were coming, and to present this confidence in the new leadership and to quiet any of the discontent that had been brewing. But it was a very bold move to make, to go against the personality cult that Stalin had created. And, you know, there was a fair amount of resistance to it, particularly from the Stalin loyalists within the party. Some of the resistors formed what was known as the anti-party group, and they did try and depose Khrushchev in 1957, but it was unsuccessful ultimately. The resistance did cause some delays in Khrushchev being able to consolidate his power, but he was ultimately able to in March of 1958. So once the dust had settled post-speech, so the speech was made in 1956, Khrushchev was able to consolidate his power in 1958, and once the dust had settled from that, it was able to pave the way for what is now known as de-Stalinisation. So monuments to Stalin were removed, his name was taken off some of the many things that his name was put to, it was taken out of the national anthem, and his body was also removed from the Lenin Mausoleum. And it definitely wasn't a smooth ride. It's a very complex thing to do to try and deconstruct a national psychology. Historian Anne Applebaum described it as the era that came to be known as the Thaw was indeed an era of change, but change of a particular kind. Reforms took 2 steps forward and then 1 step or sometimes 3 steps back. His speech and the process of de-Stalinisation had been very damaging to the reputation of the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union's image had become so closely tied to the image of Stalin. So whilst there were a lot of positives to the de-Stalinisation, it did cause some serious friction between international communist movements. And it did contribute towards the uprisings in 1956 in Poland and Hungary. So whilst we can say that this speech kick-started this idea and de-Stalinisation really did start in this period and some important steps were made, it wasn't smooth sailing at all. And really we did have to wait until the mid-1980s for things to really be through the cult of Stalin. So yeah, that is my overview of the cult of Stalin and how it sort of but kind of didn't end with the secret speech given by Khrushchev. It is a really complex part of history, and I do acknowledge that I have only very briefly touched on so many parts of it. But I did just want to give, like I say, an overview of that time to give some context to a lot of these things. I do think that this is a period that gets so often overlooked because, as we so often say, history is written by the victors, and the 1900s were full of authoritarian and dictatorial powers. So I hope that you guys found this interesting. I definitely enjoyed looking into this topic. And if there is anything from this that you want me to take a deeper look into, please just let me know in the comments or on socials. I'd love to hear what you guys want to hear about. And I know at the moment I'm doing more of these broader overviews, but I am really keen to do some deeper dives and get more into the nitty gritty of a few topics. So definitely throw out any ideas that you guys might have. And yeah, thank you for joining me. I'll put links to some of my sources into the episode descriptions and some interesting web pages I've found. And of course, there'll be the link to the socials there as well in case anyone wants to find us on there. I haven't yet decided what the next topic's going to be, so I guess that'll be a surprise to all of us. Thanks again, and I'll see you all soon. Bye.